on something of interest to me, which may or may not be something that I would eventually wind up teaching. And imagine this, I'm an orchestral conductor who's interested in Mahler. So what I'm going to present to you is actually a bit of what I did for my doctoral thesis. Lifelong interest with Mahler hooked up with a lifelong interest in something else, that being mysticism. And it started to, although it sort of started out as these two tandem interests, the study has really turned into something that I think certainly impacted my understanding of his music, how it can be performed, the imagery that's in it, the way he puts together form and uses form. And most of this is going to be on the more musicological side, but I hope to, at the end, be able to give you some audio clips that will demonstrate some of this. So, as I mentioned, there's a lot of connections that could be made to the broader culture at the time, to the general art of the Germanic symphonic tradition. The topic today is going to be mainly between the composer and this topic of mysticism as we go through. So, borrowing from Holst, call it Mahler mystic. The last minute of the sort of the problem that we encounter with Mahler when we start to look at this is the ambiguity in his particular religious, if you prefer, spiritual orientation. It's pretty hard to narrow it down. But again, given the importance of these topics in his works, particularly if you look at the second, third, fourth symphony, the eighth symphony, all of which use the sung word text, they are all religious or spiritual in some nature. And a lot of his letters are. And so what I'd like to do with the first part here is go through a bit of mysticism. What is mysticism? I'll kind of use the term, not really being sure what it is. About 100 years ago, about the turn of into the beginning of the 1900s, there started to be an attempt to understand mysticism on a scholarly level. Define what mystics believe, what their behaviors are like, certain philosophies and the experiences that they have. So the first part of this is necessarily going to be to define some things about mysticism. And then we're going to go through Mahler's letters, certainly being things that he wrote himself. The symphony text I've adopted as sort of primary sources, some of which he actually wrote, but certainly having chosen them for his compositions would be very close to him. And then statements by others about Mahler, if they can be corroborated, if they seem to be fairly universal across the two. So we'll be going through first, what is this about mysticism? How does Mahler match that? Quick introduction to Mahler himself here first though. These images occur in his letters. There's an extraordinary letter that he wrote when he was about 18 years old. I'll read it for you more in its entirety later. But where he talks about all that is sacred to me: art, love, and religion. Sort of this youthful letter. He was in a state of anxiety about a relationship, and he's kind of unleashing. But he states early on that there's nothing more important to him than art, love, and religion as a young man. And as I mentioned, the symphony text, all the way through the 8th Symphony and even later, continue with the terms of these topics. He himself was born in 1860 into a Jewish family. I think the great-great-grandfather was the last to have an official function in the synagogue as a cantor. And he always referred to himself as a Jew in his life. But it seems clear that most of the time he was identifying himself as his racial identity, and also associated with the suffering. He was also talking about being thrice homeless as a Bohemian and German-speaking land, and a Jew throughout the world. This was how he typically tended to refer to himself. His family practiced Christmas gift giving, at least in terms of Christmas, at least in terms of the gift giving, if not in terms of the religious celebration. But that already introduces a bit of ambiguity into this. Certainly by his university days, it seems like he's given up at least the practice of the Jewish faith. one of the largest controversies regarding Mahler is his conversion to Catholicism. Was it indeed sincere or not? The practical reality is he was not going to be able to get the post in Vienna conducting the state opera if he was still identified as Jewish. Cosima Wagner still, who he respected greatly, still exerted a great amount of control. And so he was not going to have that position. But at the same time, many of his works use Christian imagery. And some of these works even predate his conversion. So was there some natural draw of those images in his heart and mind? I think the one thing that we can say for sure is that he was never really a faithful son of either religion. As Dorothy Lebrecht, who's a significant Mahler scholar, said, he never went to church, never confessed, never celebrated religious rites or festivals. A journalist by the name of Ludwig Karpaf relayed a statement that he claimed came from Mahler. Mahler talking about his conversion. This is Mahler, allegedly speaking. You know what particularly offends and angers me is the circumstance that I have to have myself baptized to get to engagement. That's what I cannot get over. It is, of course, untrue that I have myself baptized only when the Vienna Post beckoned. I had been baptized for years before that. But the fact is that the desire to escape from Fellini's Hamburg Inferno awakened in me the thought of leaving the Jewish religious community. That's the shameful thing about the matter. I do not deny that it cost me a great deal of effort to take an action for what one may justifully call self-preservation, and this is the part that's interesting to me, and which one was not at all disinclined to take. So he seems to be annoyed by the fact that this was a necessity. Why should anybody care? I'm not really opposed to it. I'm not disinclined to it. But it kind of hurts me that I have to do it. Right? Pretty ambiguous. Where did he come down on this issue? Similarly, Alma describes in her memoirs. Now, Alma's memoirs, as far as being a source on Mahler, should be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, because she had ample reason to try to modify certain things about the history of their relationship. She had an affair, and certainly as the Nazis rose, she seemed to have wanted to try to Christianize him in some ways, which makes this next quote a little bit out of the ordinary. She described her first account of Christmas 1901, which is the first one they knew each other. Christmas came, the first we had spent together. Sacred to me from my childhood, it meant nothing to him, and he took my suspense and excitement as an affectation. This assertion is strongly challenged by the full text of the letter that Mahler actually wrote to her later. These are Mahler's words, we have the letter. This is him speaking to Alma. Even if we had never met, let us celebrate this day, which unites us, just as it unites all people in the joyous belief of children, as an everlasting token that we, for whom love has brought unity and happiness, should open our heart to our fellow man. For the bond that unites us has been forged in the name of a love that surpasses understanding, divine love as we could call it, and this bond unites us indissolubly with all living creatures. On this day, a day dedicated to children, a day on which the seed of love, both earthly and divine, takes root according to how it has been sown, I bless you, my dear heart. Doesn't seem like he's this with the celebration of Christmas. So ultimately, we'd have to say, who was he? Would he care what we say he was? Christian or Jewish? A couple more things that sort of connect to this. This is Alma speaking. And his religious songs, the second, the eighth, and all the chorales and symphonies are rooted in his own personality and not brought in from the outside. He never denied his Jewish origin. Rather, he emphasized it. He was a believer in Christianity, a Christian Jew, and he paid the penalty. I was a Christian pagan and got off scot-free. Right? So she's putting a Christian Jew. What is this? Richard Specht, an earlier biographer, wrote this, and there's some things that certainly present day we brace against his characterizations too, and we should, but this was his perspective. Mahler, and equally his music, was a Jew, Jewish in the impact of his spirituality, in the fevered restlessness of his search for purpose and order of the world, in his passionately dark glow, in his innate consistencies and hair splitting. He was a Christian. Christian in faith, Christian in his faith, in his trust in heaven, his humility before all that is divine, his belief in the afterworld, his yearning for disciplines, and his healthy regard for the instinctive, childlike, genuine, and uncorrupted ordinary people. Yeah, he's trying to kind of ride the fence. How can you do that? One final thing, which I think is the key to the transition to the rest of this. An alleged conversation between Alma and Gustav. He had played for her at the piano portions of the Fifth Symphony, and there's this chorale in the second movement that tries to break free of the second movement. It can't really, and then finally it's unleashed at the end of the novel. It finds its wings, it's able to finally get full voice at the end. She was playing this chorale for her. Yes, but Bruckner, he protested. Yes, he, but not you, I said. I tried to make clear to him the radical difference between his nature and Bruckner's. I could not feel he was at his best in working on the church chorale. I was touching here on a rift in his being, which often went so deep as to bring him into serious conflict with himself. He was attracted by Catholic mysticism, an attraction which was encouraged by those friends of his youth who changed their names and were baptized. His love of Catholic mysticism, however, was entirely his own. So here we are at this term, Mahler's advanced it, mysticism. We need to take a look at what mysticism is. I'll do this as quickly as I can. Not exactly the same thing as religion. We're going to paint with a very general, broad brushstroke. We could say that both recognize the beyond, an eternal plane. And whereas religion could at least be minimally said to be about defining a certain set of beliefs, a certain set of practices about that other realm, mysticism generally goes a step beyond that, to assert that the individual can have union with the beyond, with God, and articulates a philosophy and a method pertaining to that process. So, whereas in some, like you think of in the Jewish temple, there's that quote, the Holy of Holies and the human, and never the two. Mysticism says no, the human can experience that. So that's how we separate it a bit from religion. What this means is that there's a cyclical process that you will view in mystics, that experience of union, that moment of connection, of oneness. And then, of course, the philosophies and practices that are both a result of that experience, the beliefs and philosophies, and also the practice, because once you've been there, you want to get back. So there are a set of behaviors and practices that will come back with that. One of the researchers on mysticism describes it this way. While religion in general separates the divine from the human, mysticism, going beyond religion, aspires to intimate union with the divine, to a penetration of the divine within the soul, to a disappearance of the individuality, with all its modes of acting, thinking, and feeling in the divine substance. The mystic seeks to pass out of all that is merely phenomenal, out of all lower forms of reality, to being itself. Margaret First, as a researcher that we turn to a lot, she says the assumption of a world of appearances, this world, and a world of reality, that world, which the world of appearances only implies and dimly manifests. The end of the Eighth Symphony is quoting Faust, quoting Goethe, and the last stanza starts with alles vergänglich. Everything that's perishable, really image, not the real being. That's part of what's happening. Part of what's happening here. All right. So, taking apart this unitive experience, this seems to be the state of connection of feeling one, seems to be common to all of the mystics. And some specific traits about this in terms of space, time, and matter. God, or that, is perceived as, well, here, because we don't really have a good word, but it's neither here nor there. It's just, it is. I'm in it, it's in me. The idea of space dissolves. To say now, it's the best we can have for our language, but it's neither now nor then. There is no time. There's a sense of timelessness, a sense of spacelessness. And immediate and spontaneous manner of relating. This is what defines the unitive experience. And this is present in all mystical experiences. The sense of the individual self then therefore dissolves. Quite literally, there is no I anymore. You would think of using the personal pronoun I in the midst of an experience like this. It's only afterward when we try to describe it that you return to the personal pronoun. Okay, other experiences which may be present but aren't necessarily present. These are articulated by Paul Marshall. Usually in that moment of experience, it's a feeling of love. Yet not an ordinary human love, sort of all-encompassing and overpowering. It's not love like you feel for a romantic interest or even a family member. It's sort of an all-powerful, overwhelming sense. Feeling some sort of presence or power in the vicinity. Feelings of joy, bliss, peace, and calm. Not necessarily the same thing as love, but closely associated with it. Luminous transfiguration of the world and self. Everything seems to be bathed in light, or light in its very nature seems to be emanating light. Not in the sense of a light turned on from above, or a spotlight being turned on, but a transfiguration of the world itself in light. Cessation of conscious thought and of knowledge that goes along with losing the sense of space and time. It all tends to resolve. Comprehensive knowledge or awareness, almost as if you share the mind of God. These are things that are described by these texts, not all the time, but often. So, quoting from one of these texts on mysticism, I want to read this to you. This is not Mahler, this is a gentleman named John Franklin describing one of these experiences. I think it sums it up. He says, the major incident of my life occurred when I was in school, age 14. One hot Sunday afternoon in July 1949, lying on my back on a knoll under a lime tree, aware of the scents and sounds of summer, and watching the flickering sunlight through the leaves of my lime tree, my mind went blank. I suddenly found myself surrounded, embraced by a white light, which seemed both to come from within me and from without. A very bright light, but quite unlike any ordinary physical light. I was filled with an overwhelming sense of love, which he puts in a capital letter, of warmth, peace, and joy. A love far, far greater than any human love could be, utterly accepting, giving, compassionate, total love. I seemed to sense a presence, but did not see anything. I had the feeling of being one with everything and knowing all things. Whatever I wanted to know, I knew instantly and directly. I had the sense of this being utter reality, the real, far more real and vivid than the ordinary, everyday reality of the world. I do not know how long this lasted. It did not seem to be a long time in this dimension. A minute, a few seconds, I don't know. Back in this world, lying under the lime tree, I felt thunderstruck. What was that? What did it mean? Great description right there of one of these experiences. So how can there be such a diverse set of experiences? Part of this is explained by, quickly, two different types of unitive experiences. One which is known as the introvertive experience. Inwardly directed, inwardly triggered, and usually as a result of a long path of dedicated practice of one of those religions, of an established religion. I think there's some room for some sort of general sense of spirituality, but this is the type that's usually, this is what we associate with the monk or the nun, the devotee of a particular religion. What we described from John Franklin, this last thing, is not an introverted experience. This would be sort of just a quiet, sort of calm knowing. This experience is quite simply the union of the mystic with God and nothing else. This actually seems to fit Mahler less well. What we just read is the extroverted experience, externally directed or externally triggered, although it still leaves room for an experience of the one. Now, it was interesting in sort of research of mysticism that for a while these were poo-poo. John Marshall actually says his theory is following World War I. This idea of the world being suddenly filled with light and a sense of love seemed ludicrous after the experience of World War I. Mechanized, organized, global, mutual destruction. And so people tended to want to just go to that introverted experience and say, well, no, it only exists within a specific religious. Well, no, it actually doesn't, because the two experiences are pretty much the same. It depends on what comes with them, from them. Okay? So whereas the introverted experience usually needs the discipline of a long-term devotion to a particular religious practice that may not suit Mahler, the extroverted doesn't require that sort of long process. Although there are some common precursors or antecedents that just immediately precede the experience. I'll give you a few quick things. Nature. This will be very significant with Mahler. Working or resting in scenes of natural beauty often lead to mystical experiences. The specific circumstances vary widely from account to account, so that specific traits, good atmospheric conditions, for example, may be common but are not necessary. This very common antecedent has led to the coining of the term nature mysticism. Also significantly for Mahler, literature and music. Some subjects report having a mystical experience brought on by the reading of both secular and sacred poetry and the hearing of music. Someone being described as having their moment between two demi-semi-quavers of the Beethoven Symphony in London. Concern, compassion, and love. These experiences. Events which elicit a feeling of closeness with fellow human beings often precede a mystical experience. A feeling of concern or compassion for another living being led one man to a mystical experience while witnessing the suffering of a fish flapping in the basket. Similarly, a feeling of love towards a human partner can lead to a mystical experience. In addition to being an antecedent circumstance, love is also a significant aspect of both the unitive experience itself and the mystical belief system and philosophy. Informal meditations, quiet time, just sort of focusing on something. For Mahler, quite significantly, composition seems to have maybe triggered these moments. Maybe this is that way. Stillness of mind, a quiet state of mind, often described as being completely empty of any thought, often precedes an extroverted mystical experience. Sometimes a result of formal meditation practice, other times just a result of relaxing. And finally, psychological distress. Often a feeling of stress, distress, or tension precede the moment of release, represented by extroverted mystical experiences. This brings up something that came up fairly often from Mahler, the experience of the uncanny. In German, the term is unheimlich. Heimlich being homey, comfortable, familiar. The unheimlich is when the familiar and comfortable suddenly turns not comfortable. He described it when he was a young man composing Das Klagenlied, an early cantata. He had the experience of his doppelganger pushing through the wall, coming into the room. His other sort of ghostly self freaked him out so much he had to stop composing. Every time he got the passage, he had to finish it. Composing the funeral march, the Freire Jacques, the first symphony. He was an opera conductor for most of his life, and just did a premiere the Drei Pintos, I think it's a Conrad on Weber opera he got involved in remounting. So all the flowers were around in the room, and he was writing this funeral march, and all of a sudden he had this vision, more than a vision, he had this experience of himself being on a funeral bier, surrounded by flowers. It just became a moment that was quite a bit for him to deal with. At the time of composing the Third Symphony, he had some sort of similar connection to elemental nature. And the Sixth Symphony, with the hammer blows at the end, he was perfectly serene, and happy while composing it. He wanted to make sure everything was right at the premiere, and went to the premiere, and really had significant difficulty because that symbol, that familiar symbol of the hammer, which he composed, was starting to become something else to him. So this sort of connects that psychological distress and this idea of uncanny. Sorry. Almost done here with the mysticism. So we need to talk quickly about the behaviors and processes because these do show up in Mahler. These are more common to the introverted experience, but since they arise from all unitive experiences, you will see some of these things come up. More often showing up in this not in the unitive state, again, sort of in normal life, as you're having an experience to try to get back to it. This is where these things apply. The experience in this state, one of the preliminary states, God is perceived as distant, and the phase is filled with disquiet, searching, and suffering. This so often comes up in Mahler. Bruno Walter, who was sort of taken under the wing by Mahler, and certainly associated with a lot of Vermeer in his works, coined this famous sort of simplification. Mahler was looking for God his whole life. Bruckner had found God. The amount of times Mahler is referred to as a God seeker, with some anxiety associated with that, comes up quite often. This phase is typically divided into, by other people, two phases. One is called the purgative. In a way, this is sort of, these are the things that would separate you from earthly life so that you're not distracted. This tends to sound like, a bit more of a drag, right? Asceticism, self-denial, rigorous moral behavior, confession of repentance, civil service. Some of these things will come up in law. And then, typically, they move into another phase, where they're no longer trying to avoid the world, but move towards something else. And this is where practices become important. Some of those antecedent things, love, nature, these things can be very important as you're approaching that experience. Final thing about mystics, and I've already alluded to some of them, but just to lay them all out clearly here. Dualisms and paradoxes, apparently self-contradictions, all over the place. Now, a dualism is something where there's two distinct separate things, yet they can exist together. A paradox is when those two things are more mutually exclusive, which means that then the pair has a greater degree of tension. First, for good examples. Part of the mystical belief is that reality contains both a knowable and an unknowable world. That's a dualism. They can both exist. Okay, we can see that. There's things I can know, there's things I can't know. All right, there's a certain tension in that, but reality is dualism. Fine. This is a paradox. This is one of the paradoxes that defines mystics. The unknowable can, after all, be known. But since it exists in a timeless, spaceless space where cognition doesn't really work, trying to describe it is enormously difficult. But yet it can be, the unknowable can be known. Creedal faithfulness versus apathy towards dogma. Typically, once you have that experience, mystics, even some of those that are sort of the faithful sons and daughters of a certain religion, take a look back at some of the strict limitations of dogma. You can see, there's an ultimate reality higher than that. Meister Eckhart, some, others that were actually branded as heretics because they would speak some of this. Okay? So this is significant to Mahler because apathy towards dogma comes up rather. Asceticism and moralism, that side of life versus ethical indifference. Again, once you get to that unitive experience, you realize, well, I don't have to be too tight and straight about this. Emanation theory and immanence theory, this just simply says the divine out there in another place, and then he emanates into our world, or is it immanent inside the world, inside the individual? Both are often referred to simultaneously. Activity and passivity, intellect and intuition. All right. So, it takes a while to lay that out, but I think that's important now as we go through and give you some examples from Mahler's life, and I can do that in about 20 to 25 minutes. I want to finish with some musical clips from the Fourth Symphony that I think are a really clear illustration of all this. We're going to start right there with dogmatic indifference in Mahler. As was mentioned, he didn't go to Mass, he didn't go to confession, he didn't hear all these things, but yet he used these texts and he talked about these things quite a bit. He seems to, there's one of the central thing of Catholic dogma would be the view of Jesus Christ as Redeemer. He doesn't go to confession. He doesn't seem to adhere to this. Judgment does not show up in his vocabulary. It doesn't show up in his works. There's an interesting quote. Let's see if we get to it. Margaret First, again, defines these. She says she defines two strands of thoughts interwoven throughout the Bible. The first is what she labels an ethical strand, which makes every decision urgent as a matter of being for or against. The other strand she labels the universalizing strand. This is the focus on the love of God being, to quote her, so all-encompassing that nothing, and especially not a wrong ethical decision, can tip the scales. So, Alma Mahler relates a few incidents. One's kind of interesting. There was an author by the name of Gerhard Hauptmann who wrote a novel called Emanuel Quint. And Mahler describes this, again, take Alma with a grain of salt, but this is significant, I think. Hauptmann came to visit. On one occasion, we talked about Christ. Hauptmann wrote Emanuel Quint very soon afterwards. Mahler talked in a fine exultation, and Hauptmann listened in silence. When Mahler went out of the room, Hauptmann said, "Your husband expresses clearly what I confusedly feel. I have never gotten so much from anyone as I have from him." So there's an obvious implication here that Mahler inspired him to write Emanuel Quint. May or may not be true. What is Emanuel Quint? Emanuel Quint is a story about this man, Emanuel Quint, who has sort of a gentle, mystical message that God is a spirit, and that this spirit is in everything, including man, becomes increasingly misunderstood and distorted by his community. And he becomes increasingly marginalized until the point at the end of the novel, Emanuel Quint is not taken seriously in his community. But he has this sort of mystical, gentle message. Supposedly, this comes from a conversation with Mahler. If we look at the Second Symphony, the Resurrection Symphony, he found his inspiration for the finale at the funeral of a friend. He couldn't figure out how to continue with this. And he heard an ode by Klopstock. This is the resurrection part. Rise again, you shall rise again. It's interesting, he sets the first four stanzas of it, and then abruptly breaks off the text right as it's about to mention Jesus. And then he goes into something that he wrote himself. Another thing that's interesting as far as it relates to dogma is a letter that he wrote just after he met Alma. He composed the Second Symphony years before and went away. And as soon as he meets her, there's these flurries of letters and activities he's trying to explain. He can't hold back. He's trying to explain all this to Alma. So he writes a letter to her where he describes all of the movements of the symphony. And his description of the finale is quite interesting. And again, underlines this discomfort he had with dogma. The fifth movement begins with a cry of despair. Once more we are confronted with terrifying questions. And the atmosphere is the same as the end of the third movement. Third movement, cry of despair. The voice of the caller is heard. The end of every living thing has come. The last judgment is at hand, and the horror of the day of days has come upon us. The earth trembles, the graves burst open, the dead arise and march forth in endless procession. The great and the lowly of this earth, kings and beggars, the just and the godless, all press forward, all endless procession of shuddering, expectant people. The cry for mercy and forgiveness sounds in our ears. The wailing becomes gradually more terrible. Our senses desert us. All consciousness dies as the eternal spirit approaches. I mean, he's really going for the judgment, right? He's painting this image. And the last movement really does it in this march. The last trump sounds. The trumpets of the apocalypse call out to all flesh and all spirit. In the eerie silence that follows, we can just barely make out a distant nightingale, the last tremulous echo of earthly life. The gentle sound of a chorus of saints and heavenly hosts is then heard. Rise again, yea, rise again, thou wilt. Then God in all his glory comes into sight. A wondrously mild light strikes us to the heart. All is calm and bliss. And lo, there is no judgment. There are no sinners, no just men, no great and no small. This is no punishment and no reward. A feeling of overwhelming love imbues us with the bliss of knowing and being. In that state of being rather than the state of thinking. All this love, timelessness, This is what he was trying to tell her the symphony is about. The third symphony, we'll get into more detail in a minute, is our ever-increasing articulation from elemental nature. He says, what the flowers of the meadow tell me, what the animals, what man tells me, what the angels tell me. And the angels talk about redemption. And this sort of similar talk about sin and redemption. But in that symphony, significantly, it's not the ultimate. The ultimate is the last one, which he entitled What Love Tells. The fourth symphony, the song in Das himmlische Leben that finishes, apparently even Herod is in heaven. Herod is redeemed and running around heaven with all the children and everything else. Alfred Roller was a close friend of Mahler, perhaps his closest colleague at the Vienna Opera set designer. And he describes a conversation that they had about all of this. He said Mahler was deeply religious. His faith was that of a child. God is love and love is God. This idea came up 1,000 times in this conversation. I once asked him why he did not write a mass, and he seemed taken aback. Do you think I can take that upon myself? Well, why not? But no, there's the credo in it, and he began to recite the credo in Latin. No, couldn't do it. So Roller relates to this. A couple other things really quickly that relate to this. There's a song from the Das Knaben Wunderwerk, which also plays a significant role in the second symphony. Remember that third movement, the Cry of Despair? It's a symphonic treatment of the song called St. Anthony's Sermon to the Fishes. And it's a parody. It satirizes this thing, where St. Anthony comes to the bank of the river, and the fish serves an analogy, I guess, for people. And the fish that come listen to the sermon, and they nod in agreement, and then they swim away and act as they were before. Nobody's changed for the better. And that satirizes not only the congregation, it actually satirizes the minister, who seems happy preaching to fish and not notice that they haven't changed their ways. Right? It's satirizing. There's even an interpretation of the Frere Jacques being a Catholic tomb that this is sort of empty and hollow. And it's, are you sleeping? And then the lively music becomes interrupted. In that third movement of the symphony, it builds, the tension builds and the satire builds until it reaches this sort of scream of despair at the end of the third movement. Well, that's the same scream of despair that opens the finale. That's what he was referencing. He brings it back and then answers the question on the symphonic level as well as the textual level. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to have to move on. He wrote a letter to Alma, where he sort of paralleled this, this, as Margaret first says, it's typical of mysticism to find that words drawn from this world are inadequate to describe that world. And I made a certain connection in my research with his discomfort with programs, symphonic programs. He felt the need every once in a while to try to use them. He always felt the need to go to words in this symphony text, but ultimately they were not adequate for them. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to leave some things out there. If not fully Christian, Mahler nevertheless maintained a lifelong, almost burning sense of spirituality. There's that letter that I mentioned when he was 17, quite an extraordinary thing. I'm going to get into all right now. And literally a few days after starting his relationship with Alma, they've been intimate, at least according to Alma, and a couple days later he left for a concert. And he writes her a letter about how hard it is that I have to go right now, but it's like being called by the voice of the teacher. And then he says parenthetically, I use that word because I don't want to talk about God because we haven't talked about that yet. And he goes, but well, there you are. You just, talked about he couldn't stay away from this all the way through his life. He kept moving. All right, as I mentioned, nature was an important thing. He had lots of vigorous walks. He loved to do that until his heart condition forced him not to be able to do that. There's a letter to Alma in which he talks about using nature, just to connect to what we heard earlier. He's inspired by something Alma wrote in writing back to her. When one spends longer periods of time on one's own, one comes to forge a unity with nature. Admittedly, a more tranquil surrounding than the people to whom one is accustomed. This state of mind engenders a positive outlook as opposed to our normal attitude, which is a quagmire of delusions. And in the long run, a creative one. This is only normal. Isolation helps us to find ourselves, and from there it's but a small step to God. So there we have immanence theory and emanation. Go into nature, find yourself, go into the outer world to find the inner world, which is the connection to the divine. These things are important to him. Anna von Miltenberg was a soprano. He discovered her, and actually had a relationship, promoted her career. She described she said, I see him now suddenly standing still with mysterious gestures in the middle of a walk, and with bated breath and a quiet smile, avidly watching a small animal at work, listening to a bird singing. This serenity always gave way to reflection and serious, pensive contemplation, an awareness of God's wisdom, will, and wonder. He always felt the miracle and the mystery, awestruck, and with a touchingly childlike astonishment. There's been some connections to pantheism. Not really. This isn't really what we're talking about. As Walter and others attribute to. Quickly on the Third Symphony. Then to the Second Symphony, but Third Symphony, again, the titles of the programs and his conception for it. The first movement is a massive movement. It's 30 minutes long. He titles it Summer Awakens, Pan Marches In. And it may have actually been an experience of his uncanny experience of nature, where he felt connected with the very elements of nature. It gives way to a second movement, which he entitles With the Flowers of the Meadow Tone. Third movement, With the Animals of the Forest Tone. So he's moving up the structure of the world, I guess. Then he moves to What Man Tells Me. He quotes Nietzsche, and it's fairly dark. And then he moves to a song from the Knaben Wunderhorn, What the Angels Tell Me. The one I alluded to earlier, where they're speaking of sin and redemption. And then he finally says, What Love Tells Me. And another description from Adam and Miltenberg, the same soprano we talked about earlier. And this is actually Mahler. So this is not Adam, this is one of Mahler's letters to her. He said that the love in my symphony is one different from what you might suppose. And it is an attempt to show the summit, the highest level from which the world can be surveyed. I could equally well follow with something like What God Tells Me. And this in the sense that God can, after all, only be comprehended as love. So here again we see that equation for the role of God as love, love as God. It seems to be these experiences. Not surprisingly, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. Of course, music is a huge connection for Mahler. The earlier biography by Speck describes, he said one time he put the question right to Mahler, what are you, Jewish or you Christian? And Mahler just kind of looked at him and said with an enigmatic smile and said, I'm a musician. And everything else is contained within that. So this seemed to be one of his antecedent moments, one of his triggers to really connect to that. This is worth reading. This is a letter he wrote to Alma describing music. If you were to devote, Alma, a little of your time to the works of Hoffman, you would gain entirely new insights into the unique relationship between music, that eternally mysterious, totally unfathomable art, which can penetrate like lightning to the deepest recesses of our thoughts and feelings, and reality. But understand the connection between music and reality. You would perceive that the only true reality on earth is our inner self, and that for those who have understood this, the real world is nothing but a contour, a worthless shadow. But please, I ask you not to view this as a poetic allegory, but as an insight into validity that can never be refuted, not even by the sober voice of common reason. I have written in some detail today because the concept is intimately related to my fond ambition of replacing your earthenware gods with my vision of the divine, even if this may strike you at present as mere sophistry. So he's putting that equation right there. It's the last step. It's one of those steps right into that next world. And also then, at the same time, the sort of inadequacy of the words or the works of man to describe that other world. That paradox comes back into play. A couple of things before I get to my musical examples. I'm going to jump over those. So just some of his behaviors and philosophies. Metaphysical speculation. This would be part of the philosophies and the practices. Mahler, I go back to that moment that Anna von Miltenberg described, where he would take a walk and be intrigued by some small animal. He would often apparently advance this theory of what's this concealed driving force. A music critic describes a conversation that they had. He says, another day explained to me the basis for his belief in God. He urgently recommended us to read an essay by the Russian physicist Fulson entitled Hegel, Haeckel, and Husserl, in which Haeckel's materialism is examined. When you see a complicated machine, a motor car, you assume, don't you, that there is a means of propulsion involved, even though you can't see it? Well, don't you think there exists a concealed driving force within man? He's getting into metaphysical speculation, what makes us all go, the spirit, the animating force. Apparently drew some correlation with counterpoint in this. Trying to go through his improvement again. Apparently after the Sixth Symphony, he got even more and more into the science and what might possibly explain the mystery of life. In his own way, he had some moralistic behaviors and some ascetic qualities. Alma described him that way. Alfred Roller described him that way. Roller tells us that Mahler's asceticism was more than mere physical repression. He had this impression of a sort of gaunt, scarce person. Roller says, but for all his sensual pleasures, including those of the table, he was a man of great moderation. You never saw him do anything in excess. He abhorred drunkenness as much as obscenity or indecency. The strict cleanliness he kept about his person was observed without prudishness in his speech and doubtless also in his thoughts. Alma relates an episode where a soprano came out on the stage with her dress slitted up both sides to the hip. And he actually went on a tirade, ordered her off stage until it was all stitched up, and he kept going until it was just the way that he wanted. He did seem to have some more moralistic and aesthetic quality. Finally, his composition, as we talked about, was probably one of his more meditative and illuminative practices, one of those things that sort of took him. There's a story that someone tells about him sitting in his composing hut, where a hawk had chased a jackdaw bird through the window, supposedly. And he's so engrossed in his meditation and composing, that he doesn't hear this. And it's finally when the hawk flew on its way out, the wing brushed him on the shoulder, and he saw the jackdaw in the corner, and he understood what happened. But this composition is certainly one of the things that makes him. Sorry. Trying to push through. I at least want to make sure I get to this. Love has been around the edges of everything that we've been talking about, ever present in his letters and his texts. He describes to Alma about a power, in 1 month into the relationship, a power above and between us that unifies us in one. He alluded to it in his Christmas letter. Okay? The Fourth Symphony, therefore, I find will be one of the most direct statements of this. As Mahler put it to Alma, describing the Sixth Symphony, he said, dear God, how long will it take people to come to grips with it? It makes you want to run a mile. And yet there's so much to relish in this work, so much to linger over, and such an abundance of love. He describes Mahler, supposedly said, only once does it become overcast and uncannily awesome. The word uncanny again. The scherzo is so mystical, confused, and uncanny that it will make your hair stand on end. But you'll soon see in the following adagio where everything sorts itself out, that it wasn't meant so seriously after all. So this third movement of the symphony is one where he says things get worked out.
Dr. Alcor, I'm sorry, we've got a couple of minutes and then.
Okay, so it's not all the way through. About 2 minutes? 3 minutes?
Two.
Okay, so what I want to do then really quickly is give you a couple moments of this third symphony, in the third movement of the fourth symphony. And what happens is that he has, throughout, it's a set of variations. And right when it first starts, right at the beginning, you'll hear very clearly, calmly, tonal G major, deep sense of calm.
It's down below.
So this is one of the 7 variations. It comes to an important moment. He's had this bass line. And then one time he goes, he gives us the G. It's going to condition us for that G. And a transition to a second moment in E minor. Let me see if I can find it here quickly. So hear him sort of play with this. And it leads to a moment of some more anxiety. Here's the G. So it conditions him for the G. Notice how we did it. He was straight down the beat. Existential question mark comes up. And B serves as a transition to E minor. This is one moment I'm not going to be able to play much for you, but we start to have anxiety. In fact, this develops into a moment of just gut-wrenching intensity of this minor move. He goes back and forth between the two, and what I do want to play for you, this will be my last one here, is the final moment of quietness. Listen for that bass line, and then what absolutely sort of explodes onto the scene after that. Same bass line, keep putting it home. Sorry to completely let it do so quickly. It reminds me of that thing that John Franklin said, someday the world was filled with light. I think this is maybe a visual portrayal of just such a moment. And it's the key that the song, The Heavenly Life, finishes in, is making a connection in terms of key and theme. This sort of goes up all the way through. Sorry I ran a little bit.
Thank you very much.